Sheesh. Yesterday was Bring Your Child to Work Day here at Akina Incorporated, and my daughter came along with, and she decided she was going to draw me a cute picture with crayons. That's cool, no problem. Unfortunately, she went on to decide that she was going to draw on my table with crayons. Now that's a problem. No matter how much water I spray on it, I just can't seem to get this stuff off. But isn't water a universal solvent? I mean, everything is supposed to dissolve in a universal solvent like water, but as you see, it's not doing anything to this crayon. What if there's more to dissolving things than just simply dumping them in water? What if there's more to the story of salvation than just that? Well, since my daughter already decided that my table is apparently an art pad, I might as well go with it and just use it as a way to explain to you about the difference between hydrophobicity, hydrophilicity, and what do these mean for dissolving different materials. Now, you probably remember from your grandma at some point in time, she said something like, well, you know, Sonny, water, oil, well, they just don't mix. You put them together and they just split up into two different parts. There's no way you're going to get oil and water to mix. Well, yeah, Grandma's right, but there's a little more to that story than what that is. What Grandma didn't tell you was that she's referring to is what's called hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity. Hydrophobicity are any material which does not have a strong affinity towards water. Mostly these are materials that are very heavy on alkane chains or have a lot of carbon in them for organic chemistry, for example. Classic examples include gasoline that you put into your car. Octane, for example, is probably one of the most hydrophobic components you run into in an average day-to-day life. Most plastics are hydrophobic. These materials, they, on a molecular level, do not interact with water very well at all. On the opposite end, you got hydrophilic materials. So you have materials that are very readily water soluble. So for example, hydrophilic materials of course include water itself, sodium chloride such as a salt packet, which I totally did not just pick up from the nearby fast food restaurant. These kinds of things are typically considered hydrophilic. There are some items which are roughly between the two. So, one of which will be isopropyl rubbing alcohol, and my favorite, soap. Yes, soap. Why does soap help clean? Soap is what happens when you have a hydrophobic substance conjugated or attached to a hydrophilic substance. This is how we generate soap, commonly used for cleaning. However, there's different kinds of materials which have the same overall design of having a hydrophobic component and a hydrophilic component combined. These kinds of materials are what I'm going to be talking with you about today. We're going to be discussing about materials which improve the solubility of poorly soluble substances into water. This is a critical aspect for drug delivery research because you cannot readily inject oil into a patient. At some point in time, if you have your medicinal molecule is going to be in the human bloodstream, it has to be at least partially water solubilized or in some way has the ability to interact with the protein in order to become water soluble. This is an important part of medicinal delivery. Another way to look at hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity is to consider those of surfaces. So for example here, we have a polystyrene lid, which is very hydrophobic. We have a glass plate, it's a very hydrophilic surface. We'll see what happens when we add a drop of water to each. You add a bit of water to the polystyrene, what you'll see here is that it actually kind of beads up, pretty high in fact. This is because the water does not like the polystyrene. It doesn't like to touch the polystyrene, it doesn't want to be on the polystyrene. So the water prefers to stick to itself rather than spreading across the surface. This is also referred to as interfacial tension. Because these surfaces do not like to touch each other, the water is trying to restrict its contact with polystyrene to the max. Water on glass, however, as you can see, simply spreads out. This is because there is less interfacial tension between the glass and the water droplet than there is with the polystyrene and the water droplet. This is an example with water. So as you can see, that the type of surface it rests on matters for hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity in terms of how it spreads across it. So what if we had something that wasn't water, I hear you say? Oh, well, okay, let's try this again. This time I'm going to use some rubbing alcohol. Put rubbing alcohol across the polystyrene surface, it simply spreads out. On glass surface, it also spreads out. This is because rubbing alcohol has a little bit of affinity for both, but more importantly, it does not have as strong of affinity for itself as does the water. So this is a material that has relatively low surface tension. As you can see, that does affect how it spreads. Because surface interfaces between either solids and liquids is so critical, the kinds of materials which are used to affect how those interfaces respond to each other are called surfactants. A surfactant is any material that affects this process here in terms of how the two materials interact with each other along the surface. Several of the materials we're going to be talking about today are surfactants. They are a class of materials which lower, in fact, this tension between these two surfaces. That's the ticket. Okay, so now I hear you wondering, so what does all this have to do with medicinal delivery? I mean, sheesh, okay, great, you can use rubbing alcohol to clean up the crown. Yes, but you can't inject rubbing alcohol into a human being. And you can't use soap as something that's edible under normal conditions. So you have to get a little bit more creative when you're talking about surfactants which are used in people. One of the classes of polymer that we have available is what's called a block copolymer. This is a type of polymer which is a surfactant, and yes, polymers can be surfactants if they're made the correct way. In this case, we're working with typically block polyethylene glycol, which is a water-soluble polymer, combined with polylactide or polylactide coglycolide, or polycaprolactone, which are water-insoluble polymers. Now you may remember from Polymers 102 that the PLA, PLGA, and PCl polymers, the hydrophobic component, are biodegradable. Those are the materials that react with water to break down into smaller and smaller parts. The polyethylene glycol component is one that can actually be screened out by the human kidneys from the bloodstream and removed, assuming that its molecular weight is not above about 10,000 Daltons or so. In this way, you can create a polymer which can act as a surfactant, allowing hydrophobic materials to dissolve into water and then inject it into the human bloodstream. And I'll show you how it works here just briefly. You may remember from previous descriptions that we have chains. We talk about polymers being chains. For today, I'm going to treat the chain as the polylactide component. This is the biodegradable hydrophobic material. I'll use rope to represent polyethylene glycol. Now this is not necessarily biodegradable under the time frame that exists within the human body, but it is water soluble, it is biocompatible, it doesn't really have an impact on the human immune system one way or another. And so it's a pretty good polymer to work with in terms of solubilizing this chain. A block copolymer is simply this. It is a rope attached to a chain. As one arm is polyethylene glycol, one component is polylactide. This side here is hydrophobic, this side here is hydrophilic. So when you put this in the water, this side is attracted to the water, this side is attracted to either the other chains of hydrophobic material or to whatever other hydrophobic component you have in there, whatever oil-soluble material you may add. It's important to have the size correct for this, of course. If you have one that's got a really little itty-bitty piece of hydrophobic and a long hydrophilic part, this one will dissolve nicely in the water, but it won't have as good of solubility for your hydrophobic medicine, for example. Conversely, if you have one that has a really long chain and a relatively short hydrophilic component of the polyethylene glycol, this material as a whole will not dissolve well in the water. I will give a caveat here. If the chain is comprised of material that's highly crystalline, it's very difficult to get it to dissolve in water at all, simply because chains like to stack up with each other very tightly, and we discussed that before in degradation. This also affects solubility. So for the materials that have a highly crystalline material, such as polyl-lactide, which tends to crystallize, this material requires a very long polyethylene glycol component, relatively speaking, in order to get it to dissolve. For a typical non-crystalline material, poly-DL-lactide, PLGA, for example, these types of polyesters, they'll generally become water soluble as long as the polyethylene glycol chain is about as long as the polyester chain. So if you have materials where the chains are approximately the same molecular weight, which we discussed earlier means length, then now you have a component you can really work with for directly solubilizing the material you're looking to dissolve in water, directly into water. I will give a little quick hedge here. The component with a long chain and a short polyethylene glycol component, relatively speaking, can still be used to make nanoparticle precipitation or nanoparticle preparations. These are materials which are not necessarily water soluble directly to form a micelle, but there are materials which are also used for drug delivery. That's the subject of another video, however. For today, we'll be talking about micelles, and we'll be talking about how they're formed using these materials which have a relatively same length of polyethylene glycol to polyester. I'll also talk about a little bit using this to represent water and this cute little guy to represent your medicinal molecule of choice. So for example here, if we have a hydrophobic medicine, for example paclitaxel, doxorubicin, or any one of the class of medicines which have a therapeutic effect on human beings but have very bad water solubility, if you put him in water, well, he's sad. He doesn't like being in water. In fact, he's so unhappy, he'll precipitate out and become a solid. That's not good. You don't inject solids into the human blood system. That's pretty much 101. But if we combine him with some of our handy dandy chains and ropes here, these hydrophobic chains are attracted to the poorly soluble drug. In fact, they are so attracted that they cling onto him and grab him and envelop him inside of an area of hydrophobicity. And he likes it in here. In fact, he likes it in here so much, he's no longer sad. He becomes a happy guy. He's happy to be in here. Now these peg chains stick out into the water, and they allow this molecule as a whole, this grouping of molecules, to create what's called a micelle. And this micelle, the interior portion is hydrophobic, and this is what holds the poorly water-soluble drug. Well, the exterior is the polyethylene glycol chains. These are water-soluble, and they like to stick out here, and they keep this material as a whole nicely dissolved in water. Is there more, you ask? But wait, there is more, in fact. Polyethylene glycol is well known to be non-immunogenic. This means that whenever a macrophage comes along and tries to eat this, is not affected by antibodies or macrophages. This allows these types of micelles to bypass the human immune system. In this situation, they're not attacked by white blood cells, they're typically not eliciting any kind of immune response, and so polyethylene glycol creates what is called stealth delivery systems. These are materials that are designed to deliver our drug of choice to where it needs to go within the human body without eliciting an immune response against the delivery system itself. So can you show me one of these magical block copolymers that allows hydrophobic things to dissolve into hydrophilic things? Well, I'm glad you asked. Yes, I can. This, for example, is PolyVivo AK09. In solid state, it's this chunky looking polymer, pretty much like any other polymer. It is made of MPEG poly-DL lactide. Each block's about 2,000 Daltons in length, so they're roughly equal sizes for both sides. The cool feature of this polymer is that it does dissolve directly into water. In fact, if you dissolve it in water and give it a little shimmy shake, you'll see that it forms this nice, soapy, frothy looking material. Soap bubbles is a good example of micelles. It also dissolves nicely into organic solvents such as acetone. It doesn't form any soap bubbles in the acetone, but it will dissolve in these types of materials as well. So it has the ability to dissolve in both. In water, the nice feature is that once it has dissolved in water, it will actually assist the dissolution of other materials. So there's been a great deal of research done so far using this type of material, especially with paclitaxel. Paclitaxel is a chemotherapeutic agent which is used often for a wide variety of different cancers. Has a very difficult drawback is that it's very badly water soluble. And so there has been a bit of research lately in terms of using PEG-PLA as a way to improve the solubility of paclitaxel for chemotherapeutic applications. And that's just one example of the many uses of this type of material. These block copolymers are also being used for different materials such as doxorubicin, also curcumin, primarily used with hydrophobic materials. A lot of it's being focused on cancer research. However, there are other research applications that are being applied for which utilize block copolymers as well in order to improve the solubility of a poorly soluble drug. Well, as I clean my table once again, I'd like you to keep in mind what we've talked about today in terms of applications for block copolymers towards medicinal delivery or drug delivery type applications. As is common in the case in pharmaceutics, if you can't dissolve it, you can't use it. So what we have for this particular application is a way to improve the solubility of the material so that it's useful. And it can be used to improve people's everyday lives by allowing for improved drug therapies which actually have the medicine go to the site of action where it's needed. We'll be talking in later videos about more advanced concepts such as microparticles for controlled delivery over a long period of time and nanoparticles for targeted delivery. But this will give you a first inkling of the idea of how powerful of a tool block copolymers, such as this category of materials, can be for solving everyday problems in biomedical and pharmaceutical world.